All right, today we have a very special guest here in Tampa, Florida for the Propaganda & Co. podcast. He doesn't really need an introduction, as I'm sure many of you already know him and are familiar with his work, but I'll go ahead and give a brief introduction anyway. We have Aaron Mate, Canadian writer and investigative journalist, best known for his takes on foreign policy and civil liberties. And of course, he has won awards for debunking the Russiagate scandal, and he's testified several times at the United Nations in regards to the OPCW's problematic reporting on the chemical attacks in Ghouta in Syria. And of course, he's an ardent supporter of the Palestinian people and has been so for many, many years. So without further ado, Aaron, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Aaron, I want to start by talking about your early life. You grew up in a Jewish family in Canada, and your mother is a talented visual artist.
Yes.
Your father is a well-known doctor and therapist. Is that how to characterize him? Okay. Can you tell me about your upbringing as a young Jew, not Zionist, in Canada? What was your life like?
I grew up in Vancouver. My father comes from Hungary. He was born just before the Nazis occupied Budapest. Barely survived the first year of his life, was separated from his parents. And that experience of the Holocaust, where his great-grandparents were killed, shaped our whole lives. The trauma of the Holocaust, the legacy of the Nazi extermination of tens of millions of people. We grew up in the shadow of that. It certainly had a big impact on my father's entire life, the trauma from that. And from that, though, our family developed a very strong sense of justice and wanting to prevent that kind of suffering from happening ever again. And so it's that background that I think animates our concern for the Palestinian people, especially when their oppression, their occupation is done in our name as Jews. And so that was just always around me growing up. Even though my family, my broader family, does have a historic involvement with a Zionist summer camp. And I did go to that Zionist summer camp as a kid, simply because that's just where my whole family went. It's where my uncles met their wives, and it's where my father went too. My dad had an early awakening when he was in his early 20s, he was a Zionist youth group member, and he was asked to debate someone representing the Palestinian position. This was in 1967, when Israel conquered the West Bank and Gaza and Sinai, Golan Heights. And so he decided that if he's going to debate the issue to represent the Zionist cause, he should learn about the other side. What does the Palestinian position say? He did some reading, and then he realized pretty quickly that the Palestinian side was right. And so that was when he abandoned Zionism. And there was another factor too. He was noticing at the time in '67, when Israel took over all that territory, all of a sudden the very same media, establishment media, that was cheering on the war in Vietnam and the extermination of the Vietnamese people, they were cheering on Israel. And for him, something clued in, like, well, hey, how is it the same media that is on the side of U.S. imperialism in Vietnam is on the same side of Israel, even as Israel claims that they're the ones fighting against foreign aggression? So that helped sink in for him. The reality of what was going on in Israel, that Israel was actually a colonizer serving the interests of Western imperialism. And so that's just what I grew up around. Even though I went to a Zionist summer camp, that just in my household, that was always what I was taught.
What goes on at these Zionist summer camps?
Well, so it's interesting. I went to a left-wing Zionist summer camp, which I know sounds like a contradiction now, but there were people who genuinely believed in socialism and social justice. But on the question of Israel, there was just a lot of ignorance and a lot of people wanting to believe in this myth about a land without a people for a people without a land and making the desert bloom. And part of that you can attribute to the legacy of oppression of Jews in Europe from the Holocaust, going back many years, and people desiring for a homeland that protected them. That I'm very sympathetic with. But that desire led people to just be blind to the reality, which entailed ethnic cleansing of the indigenous people of that land. in Palestine. So people just didn't know, and they stayed ignorant. And it took many, many years for that propaganda wall to crumble. But in the process, at my summer camp, it was sort of modeled on a kibbutz. So people, like kids, as kids, we'd have to do menial, we'd have to do basic tasks like cleaning toilets and washing dishes, because it was modeled on like a socialist kibbutz. So we were taught the virtues of socialism while still being taught all the propaganda about Zionism.
Interesting. I think Bernie Sanders went to one of these camps as well, right?
Yeah, he did.
If I'm not mistaken.
Actually, I have no idea, but I know he comes from a Jewish socialist tradition.
Yeah, interesting.
And I will say, at my camp, there was room for my perspective. When I was very young, my dad went to the occupied territories during the first Intifada as part of a medical delegation. And so one of my first political memories is listening to him on national radio in Canada, talking about what he was seeing and breaking down crying, seeing Palestinian kids being beaten and shot by the Israeli soldiers. And he brought back with him a rubber bullet that he had taken from a wounded Palestinian who had been shot by Israel. And the rubber bullet was on our mantelpiece growing up. And that memory of him crying on the radio, plus the rubber bullet on the mantelpiece, that was just very, I think, formative for me, because it just showed to me what the reality was in Palestine. It was just always around me. So at my summer camp, I had that perspective, and I would argue it, and I was never shunned for it. There was room for it, actually. So yes, it was Zionist, but there was like a certain flexibility to it that I don't think would be in every single Zionist space. Mine was particularly unique because there was, except for the Zionism part, a commitment to social justice.
Can you talk a little bit about Israel in its founding was more leftist and socialist than it was conservative and right-wing like it is today? I think a lot of people imagine incorrectly that like Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, that these guys have like made up Israel's government forever. And that's just not the case. So can you talk about, I guess, the early years or like around the 60s, 70s, 80s, what Israeli politics looked like, how it was diverse, right? There was leftist and socialist principles and not so much anymore today.
Yeah, well, the early Zionist movement had different strands to it. You had someone like Jabotinsky, who was actually, I learned recently, a friend of my great-grandfather's, who was a militant Zionist, who was honest. And he said, Zionism is a colonizing adventure, and therefore it stands or falls by the question of force. And he explained that there was already people living in that land, and then they're not going to give up their land voluntarily to European Jews. So therefore we have to expel them. That was the honest strain of Zionism, the militant part. But then you also had people like, and this is going back years before 1948, people like Ahad Hayam, he called himself a Zionist, but he did not believe in a Jewish state. He believed in some sort of Jewish national home, but not one that privileged Jews over everybody else. And he called himself a Zionist. And that's the part of Zionism that I'm still sympathetic with, and people like Noam Chomsky were sympathetic with, because how can you fault someone for, especially people that experience persecution, for wanting a homeland of their own that just protects their national identity? But of course, it shouldn't come at the expense of the indigenous people of that land. And there's no reason to have a Jewish state in Palestine. It could be just somewhere, like, I don't know, Long Island or something, that where Jews can have a place that protects their culture. So that part of Zionism, I'm sympathetic with. And then you have people like David Ben-Gurion, the founding prime minister of Israel. He was secular. I don't know if you'd call him a leftist, but he was secular, and certainly wasn't a religious fanatic. But he too also he was the kind of tactful Zionist where he wasn't as honest as someone like Jabotinsky, where he would say in public, yes, we're going to accept partition, but privately he would write, we're going to define the borders of our own state because this land is ours. So, and there was a socialist component to it. And so you had kibbutzes, which tried to, practice socialist ideology where everybody works on the land and makes the desert bloom. And someone like Noam Chomsky, he went and lived on a kibbutz very early on after Israel was founded. So that was a strand of it. It wasn't the dominant one, but certainly Zionism back then was a lot different than it is now, which is just now totally on the extreme right. And what's left of the left in Israel is pretty much non-existent.
If we can talk about the Holocaust briefly, Your father survived the Holocaust. Your grandparents were killed in the Holocaust.
My great-grandparents were
Your
killed.
great-grandparents were killed, excuse me. Now, obviously, there are a lot of people on X who call into question what actually happened during the Holocaust. They do so for different reasons. The Groypers, anti-Semitic folks. Yeah. What do you have to say to these people that call it into question?
If you're a Nazi or an anti-Semite, then that's what you are. You're going to be a denier of the Holocaust. It's just what can I say about that? It's like like Noam Chomsky has a saying that to even enter into a debate with a Nazi or a Holocaust denier is to lose your humanity. In the same way, I feel that to debate the death toll about Gaza with a Zionist who denies this mass slaughter of children is to lose your humanity. So I just don't spend any time on it. Norman Finkelstein has a line about the actual death toll. Like, he's like, whether it's 6 million or 5 million or 4 million, what does it matter? Like, the point is, we know, it's pretty documented, there was a deliberate extermination campaign against Jews and Poles and many other groups during the Nazi Holocaust. So whatever the exact number is, it doesn't matter. The point is there was a genocidal intent and there was a genocide. A lot of people were slaughtered in an industrial way. In gas chambers, including my great-grandparents. So, and then look, if I come across someone who's coming at it from, say they've lived under Israeli occupation their whole life, and they've only known Jews, the Jewish state, as colonizers and aggressors, can I fault them for dabbling in anti-Semitism or questioning the Holocaust? No, because they don't know Jews in any other way but the people who've stolen their homes, stolen their water, bombed them, killed their family members. And so, there I can understand where it comes from. And I just would hope in that situation I could meet someone and show them that actually not all Jews are colonizers and that there's, and in fact, that it's Israel that is emulating the Nazi state. And so, and not that the Nazi state didn't exist and didn't carry out the horrific crimes that it carried out.
I watched a YouTube video between you and your father and your brother where you discussed what it was like to be a pro-Palestinian Jew. I've been to a Jewish Voice for Peace conference, but other than that, I hadn't really been given a window into the world of an anti-Zionist Jewish family before this video. So it was interesting for me to experience. Can you tell us more about that discussion that you guys had on YouTube and why you decided that it needed to take place?
Well, this was early on in the Gaza genocide, a few months in. My brother and I were in town for my father Gabor's 80th birthday, and we just decided that at minimum, what actually our only goal was for that video was just to show Palestinians that they have allies, that they're not alone, that there are Jews who support them. We don't expect to change anything, to have any impact on policy, but it's so important as a people is undergoing a genocide, a new Nakba. In fact, a worse Nakba than the original one, I think. To know that at least in a society that is funding, enabling the genocide, in which you have a media establishment that is just laundering Israeli lies constantly and repeating all the Israeli propaganda, that there are people who are seeing through it and willing to call it out, and who are not just Palestinians, that they're not alone. That was the goal of that video. And yes, we do also want to reach North American Jews, because I do think that if there was a shift in North American Jewish opinion, that would make a difference. Because let's face it, as Norman Finkelstein says, there is a Zionist billionaire class. They do have a very big influence. They're very influential in media, in all facets of culture. They were able to get college presidents fired at major schools simply because these college presidents, in their view, didn't sufficiently crack down on anti-genocide protests. So we do also want to try to reach North American Jews who have been raised a certain way, who have been flooded with propaganda about Israel, who've been lied to constantly and misled, whose emotions have been manipulated to basically make their sense of safety and Jewish identity synonymous with an apartheid state. And we want to pierce through that and do what we can. And my father especially, Gabor, being a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust, being a well-known author and doctor, he has a certain reach and a certain authority with people that comes from, it's not fair, but it comes from being Jewish and being a Nazi survivor. So when you have that background among certain Jews, there's more of a willingness to listen to you as opposed to someone else saying the exact same thing. So we just wanted to try to reach people. And at minimum, even if we didn't convince a single Jewish person, at least let Palestinians know that they're not alone.
I found that conversation to be interesting, hearing about like just the difficulty of being an anti-Zionist Jew, the threats that you guys would get or the hate you would get from people who like view you as traitors, essentially. And it sounded to me like there were many other Jewish people in the North American Jewish community that were against Zionism but don't feel comfortable coming out and expressing it. That's what I gathered, at least from that conversation.
Well, I don't want to call it difficult because what are we doing actually? We're just being vocal. We're speaking up about an apartheid state now committing genocide that was founded on ethnic cleansing. All these horrific things in Israel's origins right up to the present. So what should be difficult about speaking out against that? And why is that even admirable? Would we applaud a Nazi for speaking out against the Nazis? No, they're just being a human. So I don't want to say that it's difficult or particularly honorable. It's just our duty as human beings of conscience. Now, there are challenges involved, and it's awkward sometimes. Like, I went to summer camp, Jewish summer camp, made amazing friends there, wonderful memories. Yeah, and it's awkward when you find yourself up against, when you find yourself dealing with people who you care about being really upset with things you're saying and not being willing to fully hear it. And that extends to our broader family as well. There's some awkward moments. But again, it's ultimately, what are we actually doing? We're speaking out against a grave injustice. So no matter the difficulties or complications involved, it's just something we all have to do.
Can you tell us about your motivations for why you became a journalist?
I became a journalist because I love journalism. I love facts. When my brother and my dad introduced me to Noam Chomsky, it just opened up a whole new world for me, and I loved it. I loved how Chomsky just assembled facts, appealed to people's common sense, showed with such thorough documentation the ways in which our rulers manipulate us to do unspeakable things, and I just wanted to be a part of that. I like knowing the truth, and I like to spread the truth and to help shed light on horrible things. So I've always been interested in politics and media. I read at a young age, there was an article in New Yorker magazine about a massacre in El Salvador, in a place called El Mozote, by U.S. armed death squads. And I remember comparing that to I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I remember, like, it was a very jingoistic time. And I just remember comparing what I was reading in this article by Mark Danner, I believe it was by, with what was presented in the media. And I saw very quickly the contrast and how easily people are fed lies. And I just thought that was such a huge noble service to humanity, to give people the truth so they know what's being done in their name, and to speak up for people who have no voice, who have been silenced literally with murder at the hands of forces armed by our governments. And I just wanted to be a part of that. So I went to a school in Montreal called Concordia, and there I was there when I was there when the second Intifada broke out in 2000. And on my campus at Concordia, there was a really active Palestinian student group. And I was just so inspired by how they mobilized, how they organized together, and with very little resources, were able to have an impact, to spread awareness about what Israel was doing, to have an impact on student government, and to stand up against really cynical people in the Zionist movement who were trying to silence them. And at that time, there was a lot of Islamophobia, which of course ramped up when 9/11 happened. And I was inspired by their courage and their ability to represent their people, and I wanted to be a part of that in the way that I could. And so that helped put me on the path to journalism. And then in 2004, there was a coup in Haiti. And I'd always been interested in Haiti after reading people like Noam Chomsky and Paul Farmer, the first free country in this hemisphere, founded by slaves and punished for its freedom by France and the US. Like, after the Haitians rose up and freed themselves, France and the U.S. teamed up to basically punish the people of Haiti. Ever since 1804, Haiti had to pay reparations to France for its freedom up until the Second World War. And I was always so inspired by that, and inspired by the people's movement electing someone that came from their movement, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, in the early 1990s, and then knowing he was overthrown by with the backing of the U.S. And then in 2004, he gets overthrown again. And this time Canada, where I'm from, was involved. And so me and my friend Yves Engler went to Haiti to observe what was happening right after the coup. And I saw on the ground the contrast between what we were being told in public and what was the reality. And so I did my first sort of article for a Canadian newspaper on a political topic then. And I loved it. I loved the experience of telling the truth on something where marginalized people who were up against the most powerful governments in the world were being silenced. And I just, as someone from the West with that kind of privilege, I wanted to use the voice I had to give voice to them. And I just love doing that. So that's what I've done ever since.
While you were at Concordia, I think Benjamin Netanyahu came to speak, and you and this pro-Palestine group on campus, you guys organized a demonstration, and I think you got arrested, right?
Yeah.
And did you get expelled or nearly expelled?
No, I wasn't nearly expelled. I was charged, but they ultimately dropped the charges. And I can't remember now if there was some sort of internal disciplinary thing, but the threat of expulsion was never there, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what exactly happened? Netanyahu was coming to speak on campus?
Yeah, there was basically an intifada on campus. Netanyahu was coming to speak. This is September 2002, a year after 9/11. At this point, Israel's crackdown on the second intifada is in full swing. This is after Jenin, after so many killings by Israel of Palestinians demonstrating. And so passions were very high. And the Palestinian student groups and their allies organized a rally to stop Netanyahu, and they did. And a key moment in that protest was when police grabbed me from the crowd and pinned me down, and you can see me struggling with them on camera, and then somebody smashed a window, and then just all hell broke loose. But Netanyahu was canceled.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was he prime minister at the time, or
no? He was out of power, but he was not prime minister at that point.
Sharon was in power at the time, I think.
That would have been Sharon. Yeah.
Interesting. Does this footage exist online?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
If I can't find it, you'll have to link it to me.
There's a documentary about it.
Okay, well, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Was it like it was a Canadian
public? It's called Discordia. It's made by the National Film Board, which is a Canadian institution. There's actually a few There's also was a hit piece put out by a major corporate network in Canada whose owners at the time were very Zionist. So they did this hit piece on us. But this film, Discordia, is more nuanced. It follows myself, a Palestinian student, and a Zionist student. And listen, it's embarrassing for me. It's embarrassing for me because there were moments in that film I don't like the way I acted. I crumbled a little bit. Going back to what you were saying before about the pressures on anti-Zionist issues, I did crumble a little bit in the face of Zionist pressure. I did, a little bit. Not fully, I did. I had some tactical disagreements with some of my allies, but I worked it out in the wrong way. I'm embarrassed by that. And the film, it's good for the film because it adds some drama. But
no, it happens. There's a lot of things from my youth that I'm also embarrassed about, but I don't think it's a big deal. I think obviously your career, you've done a lot for Palestine, and I think a lot of people are proud of you for that. So I want to ask you about your career. So you've worked for Al Jazeera, Democracy Now!, Vice, The Real News Network, and The Nation. These are all very different types of media outlets of various sizes. You've been working for quite a while now, and you've witnessed the evolution of these media brands over the last decade. With the rise of social media and independent media and revenue models changing, how has media changed for the better, and how has it changed for the worse?
It changed for the better in that, first of all, people broadly across the spectrum are just done with corporate media. Everyone knows they're being lied to. I've never seen trust so low in CNN, New York Times, Washington Post. For people on the left, people who care about Palestinian rights, obviously since October 7th, it's just been unbelievable, the level of deference and subservience to the Israeli narrative. And for people on the right, Russiagate showed people that intelligence officials lie to us constantly. If the Iraq War didn't already prove that, the intelligence community taking part in framing the president as a Russian agent and the media going along with it and refusing to report all the countervailing facts certainly was a wake-up call. So I think it's very positive. There's widespread distrust of corporate media, which always serves to launder the narratives of the powerful, the people who run the country. That's a good thing. On the independent media side, I also think there's a lot of good in the fact you have so many more choices now. When I was coming up, there was Democracy Now!, which was a wonderful institution and very noble and served a very important role. And The Nation magazine, and there was something called ZNet, which still exists, but used to be a lot more popular. But a very small number of sites for the left. But now everyone now is creating, and there's more choices. On the negative side, there's a lot more polarization, a lot more infighting. Like coming from independent leftist media, there's so much pettiness. And a lot of people, including people who I really respect and have used to work with, have, I think, been duped by a really sophisticated propaganda system on the contentious issues, on the issues that require more critical thinking. Palestine, everybody gets. And I don't think there's any serious debate about Palestine anymore. Everyone understands the nature of Israel. It's a genocide being live streamed. And like, what is there to debate there or grapple with? But on the issues that I think require more critical thinking, and I'm thinking of things like the Ukraine proxy war, Syria, Russiagate, unfortunately, a lot of people got duped by propaganda that they otherwise would challenge. And I'm thinking particularly of my former home, Democracy Now!, where I was there for 10 years. I learned so much about journalism there. And at its heart, it's such a noble show. It, grew out of independent media. It blew up, and it's such an important institution. And its work on Palestine has been invaluable. It's a place where so many people who otherwise wouldn't be getting the facts about Palestine can get it every single day and hear from Palestinian voices. So it's so critical. But on the other issues, especially the ones that I spent a lot of time on, I think they've just gotten it totally wrong on things like Syria, Ukraine war, Russiagate, things where it's just on the surface, you just have to apply your critical thinking skills a little bit more. And that's a broad pattern. At The Nation magazine, where I also wrote for a while, there was so much hostility internally to what I was saying, to what Stephen F. Cohen was saying, my late friend and mentor, because we were challenging the prevailing orthodoxy on Russia. And the problem with Trump is he did break people's brains. People were so understandably afraid of Trump and his xenophobia and his misogyny that they bought into the Russiagate scam, which on the surface was being used to undermine him, but ultimately I think actually helped him, because what did it do? It channeled people into a dumb conspiracy theory that he was conspiring with Russia. And so I think to the detriment of both journalism and actually progressive causes, people were swayed to go into that. And those of us who challenged it were ignored. They just didn't want to hear what we were saying. And so that's too bad that there's been, I think, a decline in critical thinking skills in some areas of the left. But I think it's been more than compensated by the explosion of other outlets that have come along to take the place of the major institutions. Like, I'm biased. I work with the Gray Zone, Max Blumenthal. He's filled a huge void by speaking up about Palestine for a long time now. And same with Electronic Intifada and Mondo Weiss. And content creators like yourself who have helped spread really important journalism to way more people who otherwise wouldn't see it, because they don't read and they don't have the time to read and the interest. And people like you make these really catchy, engaging videos that reach a lot more people. And that to me is another exciting part, is we didn't have that before. Now we have social media videos that can really inform people in a very short amount of time, which people don't have anymore because everyone's attention is consumed by so many different factors.
I'm assuming, obviously, you prefer the Gray Zone over all of the different places you've worked for in the past. But if you could work for one of them again, which one would you work for?
Well, I mean, Al Jazeera, I was a producer there for about half a year, and I loved being in a global newsroom. It was very exciting. You're working with all these people, really sophisticated equipment, a studio, a massive global reach, and that's cool. But honestly, the one closest to my heart is Democracy Now! Because I grew up on that show and it informed me so much. And there's something personal to me about the direction it's gone in that I really don't like. You know, they bought into Russiagate. They brought on as their top Russiagate guest, not me, but a conspiracy theorist, a journalist who even claimed to possess secret evidence of Trump-Russia collusion. I don't want to name them because I don't want to name people who aren't here to defend themselves.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter anymore because Russiagate's over. But so they were duped by things that otherwise they would be challenging.
So how does that happen, especially given that you worked for and there's a connection, obviously? You could have, maybe had a conversation with them behind the scenes, which I'm sure you've already had.
Yeah, I've tried. It's just unfortunately, the people who make the top editorial decisions have gone a different direction. And, I've tried. So I make I make my criticisms publicly in the hopes that, and my hope is still that, I do believe in democracy, and I do believe that the public, if informed with the facts, can, make, common sense decisions. And that's what I'm hoping, is that Democracy Now! Will hopefully listen to the members of its audience that feels if it's gone in a different direction, it can reclaim fully across the board the noble spirit that it was founded on and has always pursued on so many other topics. I just think on certain issues, like, again, dealing with militarism, also China as well. They bought into the Uyghur genocide narrative, which I just think is evidence-free. The basis for it is Mike Pompeo, not exactly a friend of Muslims, and Antony Blinken, same thing, declaring that there's a genocide and relying on Christian bigots like Adrian Zenz, who's from a group called Victims of Communism, which is one of these Western government-tied and funded groups that exist to spread propaganda by designated adversaries. So buying into that, buying into all the Ukraine proxy war propaganda, that if you go back to Democracy Now! 10 years ago, after the Maidan coup, we were challenging. Stephen F. Cohen was coming on to challenge the coup. And Stephen F. Cohen, the last years of his life, was never invited on Democracy Now! Because they went in a different direction editorially on the same issues that they used to be at least having him on to discuss. So it's too bad. So the one closest to my heart is Democracy Now! Because I love that show. It means a lot to me. I learned so much from it, even before I worked there and while I worked there. And I believe it has a noble spirit. I just believe the fact that it's gone in a direction that serves power rather than challenges it speaks to just what a sophisticated propaganda system we have. There's no corruption going on there. There's no one saying, say this and I'll give you money. It's just we live in such a powerful propaganda system in the West that there's enough, just people are flooded with a certain message. And there's also this subconscious understanding, what Chomsky and Herman in Manufacturing Consent called the FLAC mechanism, where you sort of subconsciously intuit that if you go in a certain direction, if you challenge this certain narrative, like, for example, Syrian government chemical weapons use, or whatever it is, the dominant narrative at the time that is like you just cannot cross, or the Hamas mass rape hoax, that you're going to be canceled, marginalized, and you're going to get flack. And for some people, that's enough of a subconscious incentive just to ignore reality and not do your job as a journalist.
I see. Speaking of the Uyghur genocide, I'm going to have a guest on in a week, Arsalan Hidayat. This is a guy that I'm sure you know if you see his profile. Max posts about him a little bit. He accuses him of working for the CIA.
Well, what is he with a group that's funded by the NED?
I believe so, but this is him. But I'm bringing him on. We've been talking about having a discussion for a while, but he's going to come talk about the Uyghur genocide. And obviously, as a Muslim, I'm sympathetic to the plight of all Muslims around the world. At the same time, though, I don't know that it's a genocide. So talking to people like you, I'm going to talk to him. He's going to tell me, what's going on. I've talked to Jackson Hinkle about it briefly, but Jackson Hinkle, I wouldn't really say is an expert on the topic.
Either am I, but I know what a genocide is.
Yeah.
Genocide is not a term you throw around lightly.
Right, especially after the last year in Gaza.
Exactly. That's a genocide. The Nazi Holocaust, that's a genocide. In the case of China and Xinjiang, there's repression. I mean, that's what I can see from afar. There's repression. There's been a crackdown. But the crackdown happens after you have a number of terrorist attacks by separatists in Xinjiang. And China cracked down by establishing these camps and vocational centers where basically, unless you go to these trainings, you're going to get jailed. That's a harsh crackdown, and there's repression involved. But to call it a genocide, to me, is insane. It's an insult to people who actually suffer from a genocide. And look just how quickly Mike Pompeo and Antony Blinken labeled this one a genocide, but not Gaza. I mean, how can you even compare the two? Even before the genocide in Gaza began, the treatment of Palestinians in Gaza, I think, was far worse than Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Xinjiang people had the freedom to leave. They weren't living under a murderous blockade in which the occupying Israeli army controls what comes in and out, including food and medicine. So I don't understand how people can still cling to this genocide claim, especially when the sources for it are groups that are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a notorious CIA front. They fund programs that destabilize targeted governments, and it's obvious what the aim is for. They want to use this issue, just as the CIA does this everywhere. They find a wedge issue in a country that can destabilize it. And in the case of Xinjiang, you have repression. And look, just compare the two responses. The U.S. suffered a terrorist attack on 9/11. What was the response?
They launched like half the
exactly.
Middle East.
Yeah, Xinjiang suffered a number of terrorist attacks. What was their response? It was to have a crackdown on the Uyghurs. And of course, I oppose repression, and there's plenty to criticize there. But to call it a genocide to me is just so ridiculous, especially when the sources for it are Antony Blinken, Mike Pompeo, and far-right Christian bigot Adrian Zenz.
So based on what you know, is it every Uyghur in Xinjiang that is required to go to these camps? Or is it a certain kind of person, like someone who is sympathetic based on intelligence towards armed separatist groups? Or is it every single Uyghur citizen?
From what I understood, it was mostly targeted at males. And certainly in a sweeping program like this, you're going to have innocent people, mostly innocent people caught up in it. And it's a form of repression. And I'm fine to oppose it and criticize it. I'm just not going to call it a genocide.
These camps, do they still exist? And if so, what happens in them, these vocational camps?
From my understanding, there's like what China calls de-radicalization training and also training in jobs. And I'm sure there's some propagandizing going on where people are basically being, pressured, psychologically pressured. And maybe there's even physical abuse for all I know. All I know is I don't trust Mike Pompeo and Antony Blinken and the sources they fund as impartial. I'm certainly not going to take their claims on faith.
I have a relative who recently moved to China. He lives in Chongqing, I think is like the 4th largest city. And I was surprised. He told me like there are mosques, I fast here, I pray here. And then I found out from other friends that there are a lot of Muslims living in China and Islam is openly practiced in China.
Yeah.
And that's surprising, I think, for me and many other people when they hear it, because they think with the Uyghur genocide that Islam is just hated. But what I've come to understand is that China doesn't really have a problem with Islam, but they do have a problem with an independence movement that is seeking to break away from China.
Sure.
Now, whether or not they have the right to do so, that's up to them to decide. If they want to do it, fine. But I think people have the idea that China is just murdering Muslims because they're communists, and communists hate all religion.
Yes.
And I don't think that's the case.
Yeah. And again, when the source of this comes from Mike Pompeo and Antony Blinken, two people committed with all their soul to killing Muslims, especially in Gaza, how can we take that allegation on faith? It requires evidence. And that's the problem. Every time someone looks at the evidence, as my colleagues at the Gray Zone have done, the source comes back to people like Adrian Zenz, who's a fabulous Christian bigot. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to take his word. And I'm unfortunately, outlets like Democracy Now! Have had him on as an expert, and we're being duped. And for obvious reasons, is because China is a geopolitical adversary. And of course, there's repression like there is everywhere. But that's what the U.S. does when it wants to weaken an adversary, is they pick an issue that can divide a country and they exploit it. And that's why there's all this money invested in Uyghur groups by the National Endowment for Democracy. It's so obvious. The CIA and the NED are not spending money supporting Palestinian civil society because they don't care about Palestinians. They don't care about the Muslims there. I hope people can see that now. And yeah, we're not hearing as much anymore about the camps in China because there was an article in the Associated Press not too long ago saying that the camps are no more. And I've never been to China. I don't know very much about China. I'm happy I don't live under the Chinese government, to be honest with you. We have a lot of freedom here, which I really appreciate. And I wouldn't want to live under the Chinese system. But it's not my place to tell China how they should govern. Because I live in the West, so it's not my business. And certainly not the business of our governments to fund groups in the hopes of dividing a country and supporting independence movements because that serves our geopolitical goals.
Yeah, I'm going to have Arsalan on and hear more from him. I'm still learning about it. I think the history, I think prior to the beginning of the 20th century, the area was known to the indigenous as Turkestan. But then they came under the fold of the Chinese government. I don't know if it was through conquest or I'm sure probably through military power. I have to do more research. But yeah, my understanding is that the people still would like to see an independent state, and they see themselves Central Asian, Turkic.
And that's their right. That's
yeah.
perfectly their right. They have every right to fight for that.
Yeah.
Not our right, though, to come in and meddle and
instigate
for the goal of undermining a geopolitical rival.
Right.
You know, again, going back to Russiagate, when Russia was accused of putting out social media bots and stealing Hillary Clinton's emails, there was a national freakout from our elite who's called, how dare they meddle in our pristine democracy over some dumb social media posts and emails. So if Russia doesn't have the right to post some social media content that nobody sees or cares about here, what right do we have to spend tens of millions of dollars funding separatist movements abroad?
Right. So speaking now about Russiagate, you won an Izzy Award for your reporting on the Russiagate hoax. It's hard to believe now that was almost a decade ago, but with Trump back in the White House, can you tell us about your reporting on that story and how it affected the political and media landscape in America?
Well, during the 2016 presidential campaign, the Hillary Clinton camp decided that they wanted to frame Trump as a Russian agent. And they paid a firm called Fusion GPS, who in turn hired a former British spy called Christopher Steele to write up a dossier full of conspiracy theories, which was then handed to the FBI in early July 2016. And a few weeks later, the FBI opened up an investigation of the Trump campaign for conspiring with Russia. The FBI claims that the Steele dossier had nothing to do with their decision, but the predicate that they based the investigation on is ridiculous, and it's so obvious what was going on. Victoria Nuland, who was serving in the State Department at the time, longtime State Department bureaucrat, neocon, married into the Kagan family, a family of neocons, she facilitated the FBI's receipt of the Steele dossier. And it's obvious why now, looking back. Trump on the campaign trail was talking about cooperating with Russia. He was saying things like, we don't want to get into a World War III over Ukraine. And he was running as an anti-war candidate. He was saying that we've spent all this money abroad and all we've done is create havoc in places like Iraq and Libya. And so if you're a neocon in Washington and in the Clinton campaign and you're hearing this and you're alarmed at the fact that not only is this message being spread, but that it's resonating with people, which it did at the time, you'll be threatened by that. And so the the Clinton campaign paid for the Steele dossier. People in the FBI who harbored this long time hostility toward Russia, Cold Warriors like James Clapper and Peter Strzok. James Clapper was the head of national intelligence at the time, John Brennan at the CIA. They all went along with this. And there's so much documentation now that all of them knew exactly what was going on. In late July 2016, just as the Trump-Russia investigation is opened up at the FBI, John Brennan goes to Barack Obama and warns him, yeah, we're aware that the Hillary Clinton campaign is trying to frame Trump as a Russian agent, and the Russians know about this. So they knew about this all along, but they all went along with it because in Washington, the commitment to maintaining the bipartisan consensus of permanent war and hostility towards countries like Russia, that just prevails. And Trump was seen at the time as an outsider who was not a suitable steward of the war machine. They didn't care that he was a bigot or a misogynist. They didn't care that he favors the wealthy and wants to basically steal from working people. They didn't see him as a suitable steward of the war machine. And they didn't like that he was honest sometimes about the nature of U.S. empire. And so they worked to sabotage him. After he won, he basically freestyled his way to victory. They doubled down, and they used this as a way to rein him in, to box him in, to make sure that he didn't change anything about U.S. foreign policy, especially in countries like Ukraine and Syria, where the U.S. was running these proxy wars against Russia and its ally Syria. And so Russiagate was used to box him in, and the intelligence community took part in it. And I got involved because I saw during the campaign that the Hillary Clinton campaign was building its messaging around Trump being a Russian sympathizer and what a horrible thing that was. And I just thought, well, hey, this is really dumb, but this is like from a different era. This is McCarthyite. I thought we were past all that now. And I don't want to have a climate where it's like incentivized to warmonger with Russia, because we're talking about the world's two top nuclear powers. And I just thought it was entrenching the power of neocons who should be discredited, especially after the Iraq War. And at a time when the Clinton campaign had just sabotaged Bernie Sanders, I saw this as their way, especially after the election, to avoid any self-reflection and to hold on to the party by blaming everything on Russia rather than their own neoliberal failures, which Bernie Sanders was the answer to. Because if there was genuine reflection after Hillary Clinton lost, they would have let Bernie Sanders and his movement take over the party, because so many Trump voters I know would have gone for Bernie had he been an option for them, because Bernie had an economic populist message and was also speaking about the toll of foreign wars. So to me, this was a neocon scam by the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party that fueled tensions with Russia, criminalized diplomacy with Russia. As a journalist, factually, it was just baseless. You could just tell from the start, if you read any of the reporting and the documents that emerged from the Trump-Russia probe, there was nothing there. This idea of a conspiracy between Trump and Russia, it was so obvious what was going on. And politically, just speaking from like a leftist perspective, it was a big gift to Trump. Because if you're Donald Trump sitting in the White House, it's a huge gift if your opposition is forming itself around a dumb conspiracy theory that Robert Mueller is going to validate. And that, so rather than challenging Trump on his actual policies, like the tax cuts that favored the wealthy, people are organizing around the television, watching MSNBC every day, waiting for Robert Mueller to deliver the smoking gun of collusion. That's what the resistance was reduced to, basically, in those early years. So politically, I thought it was a disaster. Journalistically, it was a fraud. And as a journalist, if you take your job seriously, your job is to follow the facts. And the facts in Russiagate were all pointing to the fact that it was a scam. So I decided to go all in. And I knew at the time, by the way, that this would set me on a path that I could never come back from. Like once there was, it was so pervasive and such a dominant narrative, and the people who challenged it were so scorned and marginalized. I knew that once I came out against it, that I'd be on a certain path and kept out of certain media spaces forever. At the time, I was even applying for a job at MSNBC, which I knew I would definitely not get if I went all in on Russiagate. But I was like, you know, what's the point of being in journalism if I can't speak the truth, especially about something that's so dumb and so obviously dumb? And so I went all in.
I remember at the time thinking, there's no way people are going to believe this.
They did.
And it went on for years.
So long.
And it was all people would talk about. Completely outrageous. It's interesting you say that they kind of used it to kind of rein Trump in, put pressure on him. It's funny because, you know, now he presents himself as like the anti-war candidate and he's against the Ukraine war, but he actively made that war possible by continuing to fund and arm and train you know, these Ukrainian, the Ukrainian military, essentially. He exacerbated the situation. So it just, I guess, goes to show like the power of the quote unquote deep state and these forces. Doesn't matter who's president, they're going to get what they want.
It was the worst of both worlds because Russiagate incentivized Trump to be hawkish against Russia. One of his kids even said that after he bombed Syria for the first time. One of his kids, I think Eric Trump, said, see, look, this shows that he's not in cahoots with Russia. So it incentivized Trump to be a hawk on Russia. And that's why he also caved to pressure to send weapons to Ukraine that Obama wouldn't even send, because Obama saw it was too escalatory and he was worried about the weapons being given to neo-Nazis. Trump undid Obama's policy and sent weapons because Russiagate gave him an incentive to look tough, quote unquote, in Russia. And it also incentivized the media, because they were all in on this dumb conspiracy theory, to ignore all the countervailing evidence, not just in the details of Russiagate itself, but also in Trump's actions. So while Adam Schiff was saying that Trump is a puppy of Vladimir Putin, and the media was going along with this, it incentivized them to ignore it when Trump would do things like send weapons to Ukraine, or I think
They'd praise him for it.
And praise him for it. And more specifically, when he tore up the INF Treaty, this like really important arms control pact that had eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons, a crowning achievement of Reagan and Gorbachev, helped keep Europe and the rest of the world safe. Trump, listening to John Bolton, tore it up. And everyone just yawned. Democrats never talked about it, with the exception of maybe a couple times, maybe some. But like the far bigger deal was like, with the latest Mueller indictment of some Russian troll farm worker. And Rachel Maddow crying on TV that finally some Russian troll farm workers have been held to account. Not crying over the fact that Trump just made the world a lot more dangerous by tearing up the INF Treaty, which was a major factor in Russia's decision to invade Ukraine, because Russia invading Ukraine was trying to impose by force the terms that had been destroyed by the U.S. when it comes to things like arms control. And so this was their hope of basically using force to gain more leverage so they can have some sort of new agreement. It was a disaster. So Russiagate was an incentive for horrible journalism and a disaster for the world.
One thing that really infuriates me about both sides, Republicans and Democrats engage in this, but the Democrats especially, when they love to focus on how Trump tried to quote unquote steal the election in 2020, completely ignoring that Russiagate was Hillary's attempt to, if not steal the election, but at least call into question the authenticity of his victory in 2016.
Yeah. Hillary called Trump an illegitimate president. And they didn't try to overturn him with a 3-hour riot on Capitol Hill. They tried to overturn him and undermine him with a multi-year investigation by the FBI, which was baseless. And they knew it was baseless, and they kept going, even though they knew they had nothing to go on. The Russia investigation went from July 2016 until March 2018. That's a long time. That's the first half of Trump's presidency, basically. And after that failed, then they impeached him again because he paused some weapons to Ukraine while Rudy Giuliani was trying to pressure Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden. So this consumed Trump's presidency. Russiagate was a lot more serious than January 6th. January 6th was a bunch of hooligans staging a riot. There's never a threat of the government being overthrown. Anybody who thinks otherwise is not thinking seriously. Russiagate was multi-years. It consumed everything. It escalated tensions with the world's other top nuclear power, made the world a lot more dangerous. So yeah, I think Russiagate was a lot worse than January 6th.
Let's talk now about Duma and the chemical attack, or the alleged chemical attack. So you've done a lot of reporting on this, and it earned you an invite to the United Nations, I think an unofficial Security Council meeting.
Russia and China invited me.
Russia and
to
China.
An ARIA formula meeting of the UN Security Council. So yeah, it's unofficial.
And you went several times, I believe, right? You
3
testified.
times,
yeah, you testified at an informal Security Council meeting concerning the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, otherwise known as the OPCW.
Yeah.
We'll talk about the events in Syria and what you think about, the fallout there more generally later on in this podcast. But for now, I'd like you to share with us your reporting on what you called a cover-up by the OPCW.
All right, well, going back to the Obama administration, Obama puts out the red line where he says, I'm not going to intervene in Syria militarily, except for this one condition where the red line is crossed of chemical weapons use. And if you read his statement carefully, you see he wasn't just referring to the Syrian government. He also was referring to insurgents as well. He said by actors on the ground, which could mean both the government and insurgents. But for the insurgents who are then trying to overthrow Assad, the red line was an obvious incentive to carry out a false flag, because if you're struggling to overthrow a government and you're receiving weapons from the U.S. and their allies, but not direct military support, like you don't have an air force, and then you find out there's one thing that can happen that will get the U.S. to bomb on your side, that's going to incentivize you to carry it out. There was an article in Harper's Magazine a few years ago by veteran journalist Charles Glass where a former U.S. diplomat told him the red line was an open invitation to a false flag. And that's what I believe happened on several occasions. I haven't looked at every single chemical attack in Syria, but in the major ones, Ghouta, Khan Sheikhoun, Duma.
Which one was the first one?
Ghouta, 2013.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was an actual chemical attack. There was sarin used. People died from sarin. But there's been so much countervailing evidence to that one, including James Clapper, the then top intelligence official, went to Obama and said, the evidence of Assad's guilt is not a slam dunk. And the term slam dunk, that was a deliberate reference to the term that George Tenet used when he was heading the CIA, when he told George W. Bush that the evidence of Iraq's WMDs is a slam dunk. So Clapper was deliberately invoking the Iraq WMD scam to warn Obama against bombing Syria over Ghouta.
Why do you think Obama made that specifically the red line? Like, there are a lot of things to make a red line, like killing civilians is a red line, or killing this amount of civilians, or dropping barrel bombs or artillery or whatever. Why did he make it specifically about chemical weapons?
Well, I don't think it was a well thought out moment. It was sort of impromptu. It was at a news conference. He was asked about it. He was under a lot of pressure at the time, though, to do something in Syria. Because at the time, while he'd authorized the covert dirty war that most people didn't know about, he was resisting pressure to bomb militarily on the side of the insurgents. And I think the reason is obvious why. It's because he knew by then the insurgency was dominated by Nusra, by al-Qaeda and associated forces. he didn't want to act as their Air Force because he realized that the results could be catastrophic. So, and he was also under pressure. The Israeli government had been saying before then that Syria was carrying chemical attacks, and they were pressuring Obama to do something about it. So I think in response to the pressure he was receiving, as a way to sort of deflect, because I think he probably knew that Syria wasn't carrying out chemical attacks and they weren't going to, he said, this is the one thing that would change my calculus. So I don't think it was very well thought out. And certainly his aides regret that he said it because he didn't ultimately enforce it, because he didn't bomb Syria over Ghouta. And the official reason is that because after Ghouta, Russia brokered an agreement to destroy Syria's chemical weapons stockpile, and that's why Obama didn't bomb. But I think he didn't bomb because James Clapper warned him it's not a slam dunk, and he didn't want to have a repeat of Iraq WMDs.
So the OPCW, this organization, they have these experts.
Yeah.
And they send people to Syria to do their research and investigate.
Yes.
And now I might be mixing up Ghouta with Duma, so you'll have to correct me about the specifics. But from what I understand, these experts went, and they determined that it may not have even been sarin gas. They took samples from like the walls of the site, and they determined that like this is not consistent with sarin gas. And then they sought the expertise of like other experts in Germany, and apparently they determined that we're not even sure that this was the specific kind of chemical attack they're saying. And then they gave OPCW, I guess, their findings. And in those findings, it did not say Bashar al-Assad was responsible for these chemical attacks, yet the OPCW's final reporting alluded to the idea that it was actually Bashar al-Assad.
Yes.
Am I getting that correct?
Yeah, yeah. So my first answer I gave you, I was talking about Ghouta 2013.
Yes.
And that's where there definitely was a sarin attack.
Okay, so that
There were
definitely
rockets
was a
fired.
chemical
There
attack.
was, yes. It's my belief that insurgents carried it out. And there's a lot of evidence to support that. That's now in the public record.
What sort of evidence?
Well, you have a study by Ted Postal and a colleague, Ted Postal, former consultant to the Pentagon, MIT physicist. He showed that the range of the rockets that were used in Ghouta could not have come from government-controlled territory. They did intersect with insurgent-controlled territory. That study is now widely accepted. The New York Times even had to publish an article in a really mealy-mouthed way acknowledging that Postal was right. Seymour Hersh later reported of a Defense Intelligence Agency document that said that al-Qaeda in Syria had a very advanced sarin program. There were people arrested in Turkey who were tied to Nusra with the precursors for sarin. There was a study done by some open source researchers a few years ago which showed that the rockets, the positioning of the rockets in terms of how they landed all intersected with areas that were controlled by the insurgents, meaning that, again, the evidence did not point to them being fired from government-controlled territory. And again, you have James Clapper, the head of national intelligence, going to Obama and saying the evidence of Assad's guilt is not a slam dunk, deliberately invoking the Iraq WMD scam. And other U.S. officials at the time leaked that as well. So that's an awareness inside the government that there was not the evidence to support it. And that's why, by the way, in a very unusual development, people ignore this or people overlook this. The U.S. government never put out a formal intelligence assessment at the time in making the case that Syria was guilty. The U.S. intelligence community never put out a formal assessment. That assessment the U.S. government put out was instead authored by Ben Rhodes, who was a speechwriter for Barack Obama, who was a creative writing MFA, not an intelligence professional. And that's because we learned later, Clapper said the intelligence community will not be putting out a report. Because he knew, I think, the evidence did not support it, and he didn't want to be blamed for another Iraq WMD scenario. So Ben Rhodes, whose credentials include a creative writing MFA, not intelligence, authored what he called a U.S. government assessment, which is basically a press release. It's a glorified press release, not a U.S. intelligence community product, which requires analysts to sign off collectively on the intelligence to support the case. And Ted Postal is someone who poked a lot of holes in what Ben Rhodes put out there. So that's among the evidence. Along with basic logic, why would Assad, no matter what you think of him, do the one thing that he knows would invite U.S. military intervention?
Right, yeah.
When he's he has the advantage that he has air power. The insurgents don't. So why would he then give insurgents what they want, which is a pretext for the U.S. to come in and bomb? And by the way, at a time when he had just invited in UN weapons inspectors, Ghouta in 2013, when that happened, he had just invited UN weapons inspectors into the country to investigate what he said was a case of the insurgents using chemical weapons against his forces. So while these UN weapons inspectors are in the country, he's going to go ahead and launch a chemical attack, which then now they're going to go and investigate and possibly blame on him.
Yeah.
It defies logic, and it serves the interests of people who want to have war. And the same U.S. neocons who went to war of Iraq were all in on this allegation, and they've used that again and again in 20. So now going forward to Khan Sheikhoun and Duma is the case that I've worked on extensively. Now you have the Trump administration in office. Trump had been saying before Khan Sheikhoun, the first incident in April 2017, that he wants to get out of Syria. He wants to abandon this goal of regime change. He already shut down Timber Sycamore, the CIA program to arm the insurgents. He wanted to pull out. Nikki Haley was saying we're no longer pursuing regime change. So again, you have an incentive there for the insurgents to basically try to reverse that. So then you have all of a sudden these chemical attacks. So this Khan Sheikhoun in 2017, Trump bombs Syria then, I think because he wants to disprove the Russiagate allegations. Also because Obama wouldn't bomb Syria. I think that Trump wanted to show that he was a tough guy, and he could because he hates Obama. He wanted to show that Obama was weak. According to John Bolton in his memoir, Trump said after one of the alleged chemical attacks, I think in Duma, Trump said, "My honor is at stake." Right? So Trump took this personally and wanted to show he was a tough guy by bombing Syria. So then you have Duma in April 2018, and this is where I think you have just the most overwhelming evidence of a false flag. So you have people being filmed in a apartment building, dozens of them dead, foam coming out of the mouth of many of the victims. They're collapsed in piles at the center of these rooms in this apartment building. And it looks like they've been killed very rapidly and just collapsed on the spot, which looks like sarin. And especially the foaming looks like sarin, because chlorine gas doesn't immediately cause profuse foaming from the mouth. And doesn't, if you have chlorine gas, at least some people are going to be able to escape, if not everybody. It's not a quick acting nerve agent like sarin, which kills you instantly and leads to foaming at the mouth. So, but the U.S. at the time says that this is that there's evidence that this is chlorine, and also maybe evidence that this is sarin as well. And before the OPCW can even get on the ground, Trump again bombed Syria over the allegation. But then the OPCW does get on the ground for the first time that the OPCW has actually been able to deploy a team on site to the site of an alleged chemical attack in Syria. Because before that, after one incident years earlier, when they tried to get to one site, they were attacked by insurgents. So after that, the OPCW stopped sending teams and instead actually farmed out their tasks to groups like the White Helmets, which are funded by the U.S. So in Duma, they get on the ground, they do an investigation. They put out one interim report in July of 2018, and then a final report in March of 2019. And these reports basically say that there's no evidence of sarin. As you said, there's no traces of sarin. And sarin is a very hard thing to cover up. If there's a sarin attack, it's going to be found somewhere. It's going to get into the walls, into the ground. You can't cover up a sarin attack. But yet they found no evidence of a sarin attack. But the report does say that there are reasonable grounds to believe that there was chlorine gas used. And the obvious inference of the report, although it doesn't state it, but the obvious conclusion is that chlorine was used by the Syrian government, because only the Syrian government could have dropped chlorine gas from an aircraft, and there were cylinders found at the scene of the building where all those people were killed. So the obvious conclusion from this report is that Syria committed a chemical attack with chlorine gas. But then we get But then we get a series of leaks from inside the OPCW that undermine this claim and show that the original team that went to Duma wrote a report that did not find evidence of a Syrian government chemical attack and raised the possibility that this was staged by insurgents. But this evidence, these findings were censored. And the censored findings include the fact that after the Duma team came back, they got the samples returned from Duma, and they were very confused because even though this looked like a sarin attack, there was no evidence of sarin at the scene. And they didn't have any blood samples from the actual dead victims, which is odd because the White Helmets who put out the allegation in Duma, who work with insurgents and who claim to have buried the victims, didn't take, or at least didn't hand over any blood samples. So at the scene, there was no evidence of sarin. And the original team was confused by this because it looks like a sarin attack, yet there's no sarin. So what is this? So they went over to Germany to meet with expert German toxicologists to try to figure out what had happened. And the Germans said, look, there's no way this was chlorine. These symptoms of people rapidly foaming at the mouth and dying quickly just do not make sense. chlorine gas cannot cause that, because in the time that you would develop the foaming from, if you've been hit with chlorine gas, you would have had time to escape. So chlorine gas will not cause such rapid foaming in the way that you die quickly and then foam at the mouth. If you're going to foam at the mouth, that has to come up after a certain amount of time, and it's just not going to happen with chlorine gas. So these toxicologists ruled out chlorine gas and said we can't figure out what's going on. If it wasn't sarin or another nerve agent, we don't know what happened. And one toxicologist even raised the possibility that this was staged.
Can you tell me the difference between chlorine and sarin, or is it the same thing and you use the words interchangeably?
It's very different.
It's very different.
It's very different.
Okay.
Sarin is a nerve agent, a very deadly nerve agent that kills people very rapidly and causes things like profuse foaming.
Okay.
I mean, chlorine at certain levels is harmless. Like we know that from swimming in pools, right? And chlorine gas is just not known to be a deadly chemical weapon at the level that can slaughter dozens of people, have them unable to escape quickly and collapse. And we know, just if you compare images at the scene, the people at the scene who filmed the videos, they moved the bodies around for a dramatic effect. So like in one scene, someone who was in a different shot, like just lying by themselves, is now seen hugging, like with their arm around someone else. This was done for dramatic effect. And so there was a lot of manipulation going on.
So that's confirmed. That's proven that
Yes.
same body was seen and is
Yes.
now moved to look like
Yes.
in a final emotional moment,
Yes.
choking to death.
And there's a BBC reporter, Ram Dalati, who called this out and said this was ridiculous. And also he said that a scene in a hospital scene that happened on the same day was staged by the white helmets to make it look as if people were being treated for a chemical attack, when really they just ran in, started hosing people down and filming it and making everybody scared that they'd been suffering from a chemical attack. Now, of course, just because bodies are manipulated doesn't mean that they're not victims of a chemical attack. But I'm just saying is that's one of the things that happened that add to the body of evidence that this might have been staged. But again, to me, the main proof is in the censored OPCW findings, including the German toxicologist who said, we can't explain what happened here because this was not chlorine gas. And if there's no sarin bomb at the scene, we don't know what caused these people's deaths. And I don't know what caused the deaths. I could speculate, but I don't know. I'm not a chemical weapons expert. The way to find out would be to have a credible investigation by the OPCW, which the OPCW has refused to have. They censored the original findings. They took the original team off of the case. They brought in new people, and they handed this case off to officials who didn't set foot in Syria and who reached a predetermined conclusion, I think. And they've ignored the dissenting inspectors who've tried to have accountability. They've refused to listen to them, refused to let them come in and air their concerns about how their case was manipulated. And they've refused to explain why all these critical findings were censored. I've written now a lot of articles on this topic. There's never been a substantive explanation of, for example, why did you erase the findings of the German toxicologist? And why did you even erase the fact that they were consulted? The OPCW team flew to Germany, which is a big deal, to consult with these people. And on the timeline of the mission, which lays out all the major investigative steps, like, May 2018, we did this, June 2018, we did that. Why was the meeting with the German toxicologists in June of 2018, why was that omitted from the timelines? Because they want to cover up what they found. So this was whether or not there was a chemical attack in Duma, it's undoubtedly confirmed there was a cover-up at the OPCW. Now, just because there's a cover-up at the OPCW doesn't mean there wasn't a chemical attack in Duma. I think, though, the covered-up findings do show that there was not a chemical attack by the Syrian government and that these people were killed in some ways that I still can't explain, and it made to look as if it was a chemical attack by the government.
While we're on the subject, we might as well talk about Syria broadly now. Yeah. So before I ask you about like the Timber Sycamore program, before I talk to you about how you feel about HTS coming to power now, essentially, and Jolani, earlier in this conversation, you told me that people have mischaracterized your position. So if you could take a moment to tell us exactly what is your position on Syria and everything that happened there, and then we can start talking about these specific programs and the U.S. involvement.
My position on Syria is the same position I have in every country around the world, that it's not my business. I'm not Syrian. If you want to overthrow your government, if you see them as illegitimate, that's totally your business and you're right. I just don't think that the U.S. and Israel have the right to be involved and to take part in that, especially when the consequences to me have been so catastrophic. I mean, maybe in some ideal world that there was like a a bloodless way to remove Assad and bring in someone who represents the Syrian people more than he did? Sure. I mean, I'm not going to be, I can't blanketly oppose that, but the way this was carried out to me has been a disaster. And I understand that many Syrians feel it was worth it. And that's their right. But as an outsider, I just can't sign on to the self-declared right of foreign governments, much more powerful governments in Syria, joining together, U.S., Israel, Turkey, the Gulf states, NATO states, to fund one of the most well-armed insurgencies in history, especially when that insurgency, we all know now, was dominated by Nusra. I know at the beginning things are a little bit more complicated, but that was ultimately what happened. I have friends who went and protested Assad in 2011. But what the insurgency became is not what they were fighting for. They were against corruption. They wanted freedom of expression, and fair enough. But that's not the side that the U.S. supported. And I just can't cheer that on. And I can't cheer on sanctions that were imposed to punish the Syrian people in the hopes that the state was so decimated that ultimately regime change could happen if it couldn't be achieved through a dirty war. And that's what happened. The country was so destroyed by war and then sanctions that destroyed the Syrian currency even more, that prevented Syria's reconstruction, as U.S. officials openly bragged about, that crushed Syria's economy, in the words of James Jeffrey, a top Trump official who worked on Syria, coupled with a U.S. military occupation that stole Syria's oil and wheat deliberately to deprive the government of resources. How can I support that? It's A, not my right as a Westerner to impose regime change on a foreign country, and B, I don't think this ultimately is in the interest of Syria's long-term future. And if a Syrian who suffered under the government, who was tortured, who faced repression, if they believe it was all worth it, that's entirely their right. But I hope they can understand that that doesn't mean that people from the outside have to be on board with supporting this, especially when also I think this serves the interests of Israel. Israel played a major role in this. They armed insurgents, not the main forces, but they armed some. They took part in the war against Syria. They weakened Syria's allies, Hezbollah, and I think without that, this regime change wouldn't have happened. So I can't share something that serves the goals of Israeli hegemony. But I understand for Syrians who've suffered under the government, who are focused on their country, not broader geopolitical issues, that their concerns are going to be more local and more immediate for them and their families, and that's their right. For me as an outsider, I don't think it's my right to be involved in overthrowing their government.
Can you talk to me about Timber Sycamore? Because I've seen people talk about how you said this is the most well-funded. How did you describe it?
One of the most well-funded insurgencies in history.
Insurgencies in history. Now, I've heard people who are anti-Assad criticize your work, and they've specifically talked about how a few $1 billion is nothing. The Timber, and they're referring to the Timber Sycamore program. So could you tell me what is the Timber Sycamore program, and demonstrate to me why this was the most well-funded insurgency program, and how a few $1 billion in an insurgency like this or a civil war like this isn't just chump change, that this does make a difference?
Well, the fact is we don't even know the exact dollar amount because that's secret. And I think it's secret for good reason, because it was a lot more than a few $1 billion. And it wasn't just a few $1 billion from the CIA. This also was the Gulf states spending a lot of money, and they can afford it, to arm the insurgency. According to leaked documents from Edward Snowden, the CIA program in Syria amounted to about $1 of every $15 in the CIA's budget. It's a lot of money. It's a lot more than a few $1 billion. And you can see that. The rebels got a lot of weapons, and that was decisive in helping them capture places like Idlib. And I'd love to know the exact amount, but the fact that it's secret should tell us something, that it's a lot more than a few $1 billion. So, So
if you don't know the exact amount, why do you say it's the most well-funded? How do we know that?
If Edward Snowden says, if NSA leaks say that it was $1 out of every $15 in the CIA's
total budget. And what is their total budget at the time?
We don't know. It's a lot more than $15 billion or $30 billion. It's a lot of money. And the toll put up, I believe, by the New York Times was $1 billion every single year. But I think it's even more than that, especially when you add all the money spent by other governments, including Qatar and Saudi Arabia, who spent a lot. I mean, speaking to people in Yarmouk, in the refugee camp in Yarmouk, the salaries of the insurgents that they were paid was a lot of money, a lot more than people were making in Yarmouk. And like, how do you afford that? You have foreign money. And the New York Times called this one of the costliest covert wars in CIA's history. So yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence that this was a really expensive.
When did this
war.
program start?
Officially started in 2012, but I suspect it started
this is a
earlier.
couple months into the protests and the revolution, and then the start of the uprising.
The uprising breaks out in the spring of 2011. The program formally is launched in 2012, but I suspect it began earlier because pretty quickly you had weapons going from Libya and the U.S. taking the looted stockpiles of the Libyan government and sending them off to Syria in 2011. So I suspect the CIA program actually began pretty early on.
So how does a dirty war work exactly? Because the CIA can't, like, they receive money from the government. We know every year how much, the government gives to the military, et cetera, et cetera. But they're not going to publish and say, we gave, $100 million to this group. So how does the money trail work and the, facilitating movement of weapons, things like that?
By the way, just one more dollar figure. According to the Washington Post, the U.S. spent over $100,000 for every insurgent who went through the CIA program. $100,000 per insurgent. That's a lot of people. So that just gives you a sense of the scale of this program. So yeah, that's what they use their money.
So these insurgents who went through training, how to fire a gun, how to fight, et cetera.
They were trained by the CIA in Jordan and Turkey.
They were paid $100,000 salary?
No, the U.S. spent $100,000 to train them and arm and equip them. And they were trained in Jordan and Turkey and who knows where else. And because the CIA has bases there. And they were armed through they were armed through Libya up until Christopher Stevens, the ambassador, was killed in Benghazi, and then that stopped. But then they were armed still through Turkey and Jordan. And it was a dirty war. I mean, that's the beauty of it from the point of view of someone trying to overthrow a government. It's hidden from us. We don't know still exactly how much was spent. We don't know exactly who was armed, but we have a pretty good idea. It was the Free Syrian Army, but we don't know, did the Free Syrian Army give its weapons over to Nusra? Like that happened. Sometimes Nusra just took the weapons, stole it from them. And who knows what other shady actors were armed. Like that's how these things work. We won't find out maybe ever. And if we do, maybe it'll be 70 years from now, the exact dollar amount and the exact way. But what we know is the CIA spent a lot of money on this, was operating from bases in Jordan and Turkey, had battlefield rooms where in the battle for Idlib, where Nusra took over Idlib, the CIA was directly involved in that. They gave tow missiles to the insurgents who fought alongside Nusra, and those were critical to destroying Syrian government tanks and helping an al-Qaeda-led force, Nusra, take over Idlib. So the CIA was basically working with al-Qaeda. That's why Jake Sullivan wrote to Hillary Clinton, al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Joe Biden also blurted this out. He said there was no moderate middle in Syria. The insurgency was dominated by Nusra, and that's who got the weapons. And he gave a figure of how much weapons they got, and he said it was in the tens of thousands of tons or something like that. So it was a lot of weaponry.
The rest of this podcast episode is available for Propaganda & Co. members only via our website. If you'd like to watch the full discussion, please make an account at propandco.com. Your support makes our work possible, so thank you to all our members. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing to our channel. Also, if you'd like to support what we do, please consider becoming a paid subscriber on our website, where we post exclusive documentaries, podcasts, and videos just like this one about geopolitics, current events, and history. We built this website because of continued censorship of our videos, so please do consider becoming a member. Until next time.